I'm Mohammad Tawakkoli, and as the director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies, I welcome you all to our weekly seminar series. In addition to the York University's Department of History, Languages, Literatures, and Linguistics, and the York Center for Asian Studies, Ryerson's Department of English has co-sponsored this program, our series. Also, the Department of History, Historical Studies, Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at UTM, the Cinema Studies Institute, the Center for Comparative Literature, and Critical Studies in Equity and Solidarity at the University of Toronto are sponsoring our weekly seminar series, which is devoted to the twin topics of women poets and also Iranian cinema. I'm grateful to all of you who are here and also for the critical support of all the sponsoring academic units. In addition to be grateful to you for your participation, I'm thankful to my colleagues, Professor Leila Purtawaf, Khater Sheibani, نیما نقیبی، گلبرگ کابطلایی، شهرزاد مجاب، ویکتوریا طهماسبی، سارا سلجوقی، مهدی والیزاده، جیران گاهان، رضا کرمانی, Arshivaz Muzaffari, and Azita Talagani for their invaluable support of women poets and Iranian cinema projects. I also like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto and York University operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and prosper on their land. I also want to express my gratitude to York University for hosting today's session. It is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Dominic Brookshaw, our speaker for today, to Toronto. My colleague and collaborator, Professor Azita Talagani, will introduce Professor Brookshaw and moderate today's session. Professor Talagani.
Thank you, Mohammed. It's a great pleasure and honor, honestly, to introduce Professor Dominic Parviz Brookshaw, who is a Senior Research Fellow in Persian and Wadham and Associate Professor of Persian Literature at the Oriental Institute of Oxford University. He holds a Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford in medieval Persian poetry. The current focus of Professor Brookshaw's research is intersection between performance, patronage, and desire in texts produced by poets and other literati who were active in Shiraz in the 14th century. In terms of modern period, Dr. Brookshaw looks at women poets and their royal patrons in the first half of the Qajar period, 1797 through 1848. Dr. Brookshaw's research on modern 20th century Persian poetry is centered on Iranian poets and their dialogue with an ultimate subversion of the Persian poet canon. His other research interests include poets of Iranian diaspora, non-Muslim religious minorities in Iran, and Persian language learning. Dr. Brookshaw has numerous publications, including monograph, journal articles, book chapters, and also Persian language textbooks. He's currently working on a monograph in which he investigates the role played by poetry in the formation of a royal cultural policy in early 19th century Iran. Before arriving at Wadham College in September 2013 and joining the Oriental Institute of Oxford University, Professor Brookshaw taught Persian literature and language at Stanford University, University of Manchester, McGill University, and University of Oxford. From 2004 to 2014, he was assistant editor for Iranian Studies. He is a former member of the board of the International Society for Iranian Studies and of the Governing Council of the British Institute of Persian Studies. He currently serves on the editorial board of Middle Eastern Literature. The title of Professor Brookshaw's lecture today is Feminine Intervention, Early Qajar Women Poets, and their Engagement with Bazgasht-i Adabi. Please join me welcome Professor Brookshaw, and thank you so much, Professor Brookshaw, for coming back to us and giving this opportunity today, having you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Talabani, for a very generous and far too lengthy introduction, but many thanks nevertheless. Thank you to Mohammed in particular for inviting me and for making this happen, and to every institution and university that is involved in what really is a wonderful series, bringing people together, especially during this time where we can't meet most of our colleagues in person. It's really wonderful to have this opportunity to have dialogue and to share new work, ongoing work, and to receive feedback. It's really wonderful to see so many colleagues and friends here today, and I thank you all very much for taking the time on a Friday afternoon or a Friday evening or a Friday morning, depending on where you are in the world, to listen to some of my current research, and I very much look forward to your feedback and your questions afterwards. I hope to not speak for too long, and as I said, this is work in progress. It is my current project that I'll be working on in particular and very intensively in the writing of a new book on the topic of poetry in the first half of the 19th century in Iran, not only focused on women, but women play an equal role in my book alongside male poets. I also look, as you will see today, at poets who are writing in provincial centers, including centers which are not ethnically Persian, however we might define that. I also look in my book at people who are writing within what could be called heterodox religious communities. So it's quite a broad view that I have of the Bazgasht, and that hopefully will come across to a certain extent in my presentation today. At the same time, I'm trying to look at the relationship between the new capital, the new center of Qajar power in Tehran, and its relationship to these provincial centers of learning and culture. So I will start, and very much thanks to Reza, who I will prompt to change the slides for me. At the moment, we can stick with the opening slide. What contribution did women make in the early 19th century to the production of poetry in Iran? To what extent can these women poets be considered active players in what is called nowadays the literary return movement, the Bazgasht-i Adabi? And to what extent can early Qajar women poets be viewed as equal players within the millennium-long history of new Persian poetry? Conventional scholarship has very little to say about the involvement of women poets in the neoclassical Bazgasht-i Adabi in the period of around 1790 or 1800 to about 1860. Overlooked in the scholarship or dismissed as marginal, the evidence presented in my lecture today will hopefully show that as the process of the institutionalization of the Bazgasht-i Adabi accelerated in the new capital, Tehran, there existed women poets active in literary communities beyond the new capital, whose poetry was progressing in line with what we see in the court-sponsored aesthetic parameters of Tehran and some other major princely provincial courts. Focusing on two poets, Valiyeh Qajar, who was born probably in 1803 and died in 1861, and her co-wife, Masture Kordestani, born around the same time as Valiyeh, but who died slightly earlier in 1848, I will show how women poets across Iran engage with the dominant literary ethos of their time, Walia and Masture helped to shape their local literary community, which was based in Sanandaj, and forged poetic networks in pen and in person that extended far beyond Iranian Kurdistan. They demonstrated their literary erudition through crafting fine imitations of and creative responses to canonized female and male medieval poets. By decentering male-driven and male-focused narratives of Iran's last truly indigenous literary movement, it becomes possible for us to recognize that even in towns on the periphery of the Qajar Empire, amateur female poets were producing poetry of an analogous level of sophistication to that of the professional poets employed at the imperial center. There are precious few analytical studies of women's poetry in 19th century Iran. Those who have written about Qajar women poets have tended to emphasize, and here we can move perhaps to the second slide, have tended to emphasize the careers of individual poets, rather than examining the literary trends or movements that women contributed to and or that shaped the broader literary context of women's writing in the period. Scholars wishing to write the history of the literary activity of women in Qajar Iran are faced with a paucity of available texts. With all their limitations, those texts that have survived provide, I believe, ample evidence of the active involvement of women in the production and also in the patronage of poetry. It was through composing poetry that a number of women in 19th century Iran sought to leave a lasting mark on the tradition they considered themselves to be part of. If we look at these three extracted quotes that I've presented here, and hopefully you can notice that I've bolded certain phrases. The first is from a book chapter by Hanaway from 1990. If we look at the bolded, so as not to bore you by reading the whole quote, he talks about how women always, throughout the history of Persian literature, have spoken softly. Persian literature is a man's world. And those very few women who spoke for themselves spoke in a kind of half voice, mezza voce. That any literature, poetry in particular, produced by women was always felt by men to be subversive. He makes the claim, which not only I, but I think many other scholars could prove to be false, that women were allowed no words in public. Of course, it depends how we define public. And they were allowed no presence in public. Also, I would say a false claim. The second is a quote from Farzaneh Milani's wonderful Veils and Words, a really foundational text in the study of women's writing, particularly in the 20th, but also in the later part, the middle and later part of the 19th century. Farzaneh, whose work I do build upon, I believe, talks about how women writing and women putting their compositions into the written word on paper, as it were, was considered as much of a transgression as unveiling. I think I will show today that that perhaps is not true in every instance. But she does make a claim that I think we have enough evidence to counter, which is that the composition of poetry could not be included, as she says, in the repertoire of proper behavior for women, and that it was a filial activity passed from fathers to sons in a long tradition. Again, we will come back to that later on. These ways of reading women's poetry in the 19th century, but even going into the 20th century in the context of Iran, are not limited, of course, to scholars working outside of Iran. The third is a quotation, my translation, from something written by Shafi'i Kadkani, really Iran's most prominent literary critic and professor of Persian literature. Here he's talking about Qajar poetry as a whole, and saying that there are no personal experiences that are expressed or related or depicted within it. He says not even a single one of these moments, of these he refers to them as private, personal moments, is present in the entirety of the verses written by poets in the Qajar period. He refers to the poets of the Qajar period as collectively a group of non-poet poets, sha'iran na sha'ir, something like that. He says not one personal moment has been experienced or recorded in their poems. I think again today we will see that that is not quite the case. So how can we get beyond these somewhat unhelpful characterizations of women poets and writers in Qajar Iran? I believe the only way to do so is through a close reading of literary and historical source material from the period, from the early 19th century, which can provide us with much evidence to challenge some of these widely held assumptions, such as the assumption that women did not contribute to the literary milieu out of which grew the neoclassical literary reforms of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, known to us today as the Bazgasht-i Adabi. My reading of these texts allows me to problematize the assumption that women's involvement in building the foundations of modern poetry in Iran was minimal, and more crucially, that it was a late phenomenon, that it came after such activities by men, and that it was one that only emerged with or shortly before the 20th century. Scholars of Persian literature have tended to present the women poets of Qajar Iran as exceptional cases, rather than players within complex and interconnected networks populated by both female and male poets. By examining poetry produced by women, we can uncover clues as to their familiarity with the objectives of the Bazgasht as we understand it. And we can gauge the degree to which the influence of court poets, and court poets included female poets as well as male, and how the influence of court poets at the center or at princely provincial centers penetrated beyond the somewhat narrow literary circle that was centered on Iran, and how it fanned out across Iran into provincial settings in which women poets practiced alongside local male peers. By situating women's poetry within a wider literary context that also includes male poets, and by reading women-focused works in conjunction with male-centered texts of the same era, we are able to break away from established modes of analysis that have been resistant to studies that cut across gender lines. Persian poetry flourished during the first 4 decades of the 19th century, as a large number of poets of considerable talent were attracted to the new capital by the promise of generous royal patronage. Many of these poets had, of course, begun their careers in Esfahan or in towns nearby that were connected to Esfahan, such as Qom and Kashan, and were connected also to the founders of the Bazgasht-i Adabi, that poet-centered kind of grassroots literary movement of 18th century post-Safavid Esfahan, discussed most recently by Kevin Schwartz. Some have suggested that Fath Ali Shah actively sought to emulate the cultural example set by medieval Muslim rulers in attracting large numbers of poets to his court and providing them with generous patronage. With respect to his interest in poetry and poets, Fath Ali Shah far surpassed his Zand predecessors, who really took no more than a passing interest in both. Regardless of the circumstances of the emergence of the movement that came to be known as the Bazgasht, it was only with the substantial patronage of the early Qajar court at Tehran that the movement came into full bloom. The new Shah not only co-opted this literary movement, he nurtured it. Under Fath Ali Shah, a greater degree of political stability gradually emerged in Iran, and the arts, in particular poetry, flourished. The fact that the new Shah was actively involved in both patronizing and producing poetry is not without significance. Moreover, many of the stars of the literary return movement were Qajar princes and courtiers directly involved in the affairs of state. Though not counted among the official members of the Anjuman Khaqan, the Royal Literary Society, a significant number of the Shah's daughters were also trained in the poetic arts and composed poetry of an impressive standard. the Anjuman Khaban, headed by the chief court poets Sahab, Sabah, Nashad, and Mijmar, espoused and promoted unequivocally neoclassical aesthetic principles, such as the imitation of pre-Safavid Mughal, primarily pre-Timurid poetry, and the rejection of the ornate and complex features of the so-called Indian style, Sabke Hindi, that had dominated Safavid literary salons. In Karimi Haqqaq's estimation, the Bazgasht poets, in their attempt to approximate the compositions of the earlier masters, deliberately and purposefully minimize the space for innovation in Persian poetry. Their neoclassical zeal compelled them to look backwards, not forwards, and saw them consistently privilege the voices of the past over those of the present. Now we can move to the next slide. We're all very familiar with the map of Iran, but to give a sense of the relationship between Tehran and in particular Sanandaj and Kurdistan that I'm about to talk about, I thought it would be useful to have this map here. But is there scope for us to read Qajar neoclassical imitation on a deeper level, one that allows us to appreciate the erudition and full knowledge of past masters that facilitate such an engagement with the tradition? And what of the emergent indigenous Persian canon and homegrown approaches to the writing of literary history? So now I focus on one of my examples, which is Sanandaj, the capital of then the Ardalan realm of Kurdistan. The Ardalans, mimicking royal literary norms, patronized a circle of poets at their court in Sanandaj. In the first half of the 19th century, Sanandaj was a not insignificant provincial center for Persian poetry, and evidence for the vibrancy of the Persian literary life of Iranian Kurdistan in this period is found in a text known as the Hadiqe Amanullahi, or Amanullah's Garden, a proudly local anthology of more than 40 living and recently deceased poets, completed in 1849 by a local poet and writer known as Ronaqe Sanandaji. True to its name, Ronaq's anthology sports a garden-inspired structure. It starts with a khiyaban, and here by khiyaban he means tree-lined avenue within a larger garden. And that khiyaban here is a summary of Sanandaj's merits in prose and in verse, followed by Golbone Avval, the first rosebed, a selection of the new rulers, the new Wali's poetry. Golbone Dovom, the second rosebed, a survey of local male poets. And then very interestingly, Juybar, the stream, a substantial section devoted to the two female poets I mentioned at the beginning, Masture Kurdistani and Waliye Qajar. And it ends with Goldaste or bouquet, examples of the compiler's own poetry with information on what inspired him to compile the work. Ronaq's anthology is replete with anecdotal information that helps us gauge the prevailing aesthetic tastes in his locale at the time of compilation. Ronaq cuts through the conventionally male homosocial space of the Tazkireh by inserting a substantial separate section on Sanandaj's most famous female poets, which features an impressive, and if we think within anyone who knows Tazkireh of the period or Tazkireh in general, will be impressed by the number of lines quoted from the poetry of Masture, which is a total of 251, which is very substantial for a Tazkireh, and 89 lines from the poetry of Waliye, also very substantial. Ronaq tells us about these poets' immediate literary orbit and their place within it. It is clear that the participation of both these women in the literary life of Sanandaj was supported by the town's male poets, and that they, or their texts, enjoyed access to elite androcentric social circles. Slide 4, please, Reza. Here, I won't read them, I'll let you look at them. We have my translations of 4 short quotations about Waliye Qajar, whose given name was Hosne Jahan Khanum, The first from a history, Tarikh Zulqarnain, a court history produced in Tehran by Khavari Shirazi. The second is from the anthology of Ronaq Sanandaji. The fourth from Azad-e-Dawleh's famous history, really, of the family and the progeny of Fath Ali Shah, Tarikh Azadi. And the fourth from Divan Begi Shirazi's later anthology, very substantial anthology of dominated by 19th century Persian poets. Praised in contemporary texts for her thoughtfulness, generosity, eloquence, and beauty, Hosn Jahan Khanum, Fath Ali Shah's 21st daughter, is better known by her royal title Valiyeh, or female governor. In 1819, Amanullah Khan Ardalan, the tributary governor or Vali of Kurdistan, came to Tehran with 10,000 gold coins and 20 fine carpets to ask for Hosn Jahan Khanum's hand for his heir apparent, Khosrow Khan. The Vali believed that this interdynastic power marriage would cement the cordial relationship between the Qajar and the Ardalan houses, and the Shah viewed this marriage as a way to forge a link between the Qajar center and one of its more dynamic peripheries. The princess received the title Valiyeh from her father upon marriage, and the 10-day nuptials are said to have cost in the region of 100,000 tomans, almost half of which was spent on the bride's jewelry. This is very, very substantial for the time. When Amanullah Khan died in 1824, Valiyeh's closeness to the Shah ensured a smooth transition of power from the father-in-law to her husband. Her husband, who's known as Khosrow Khan, himself a poet, but certainly a patron of poets, was infamous for his dissolute debauchery, but was ironically dubbed Nakam, a term normally used to describe men who die young before living life to the full. One must imagine that there was some humor in the naming of him as Nakam. Valiyeh wrote not only poetry, she considered herself to very much be a Sufi and to follow a mystical path. She wrote a short text on love, which is not exclusively or does not exclusively invite a mystical interpretation. It's called Basat-e-Nashad. But it is replete with not only, as we would expect, pre-Timurid, Timurid, and some Safavid poetry in quotation, but she also quotes poets from the Zand and contemporary poets from the Qajar period to prove her points about love that she is explaining in this text. What is fascinating is that it shows the breadth of her access probably to libraries, both at Tehran and in Sanandaj. The Ardalans are known to have had a very large library themselves. But it also shows an appreciation for the kind of full span of New Persian poetry, rather than, as we're meant to believe, in the 19th century, poets had started to ignore Safavid and even maybe some of the earlier attempts in the Zand period to write imitation of medieval poetry. But she has examples of all. She left us a divan of approximately, depending on which manuscript you look at, 600 to 700 lines of poetry, and most of this is in ghazal form. What is very interesting is that there is nothing that I have found in Qajar texts, whether they're chronicles or tazkires, both royal and provincial, that suggests that the writing of poetry was in any way considered improper for elite women. I have not found that in the text that I'm looking at. Though Valiyeh may have felt some anxiety regarding the dissemination of her poems, there is no evidence that the men around her considered the mere fact that she wrote poetry, or any other form of writing, and considered these facts to be intrinsically rebellious or transgressive. Valiyeh's poems, like those of her co-wife Mastureh, traveled far beyond private family circles. And the fact that compositions by both poets found their way into numerous Qajar tazkires proves that these women were by no means denied a public readership. one thing that's very, very interesting about Volière is that when her husband died and her eldest son, who was to be his heir, was a child of perhaps 10 years of age, what happened was that Volière stood in as a kind of regent for her son, and is said by almost all of these texts to have ruled in his place as a regent, so as a vice-regent. They either, in the text, talk about her as having his vekalat and using that to rule. If we look at the, yes, in this next, even in this first quotation here, sorry, she governs in her own right. She manages her affairs most adequately. She is uniquely talented. Azodi says she ruled alone for many years in Kurdistan with perfect independence. This is, female rule and involvement in female politics is not the focus of the work I'm doing, but I think it adds a certain, quite an important context to her poetry and must be taken seriously in tandem with it. She both had her son's vekalat, which is described as also being the kafel, or the executor in a way, of her son's affairs. Very interestingly, these texts also quite often mention her in relation to the adjectives or the adverbs mardane and khadivane, that she had a ability to rule and to present herself and to interact with others in a manly and a kingly manner. Now, we can discuss what that means perhaps later, but these things are said repeatedly about Volière. Why don't we now look at the next slide, which is an example of one of Volière's poems, one of her ghazals. For anyone who knows the poetry of Hafiz, this is immediately, obviously, a imitation and a response, not to only one poem, but really to, as I've studied, a kind of group of poems in either the style of Hafiz or Hafiz himself. Just the way that the poem opens itself. دوش به میخانه زد هاتف غیبم سروش منتظر فیض باش قب مخور و می بنوش پرتو حق منجلی از رخ زیبای دوست دیده بر آن جلوه دوز چشم ز عالم بپوش. The poem goes on in a way that it's as though we are hearing Hafiz retold in the Qajar period. The way in which ghazals end, of course, is always very important. The use of the takhallus of the poet, adding to at least some sense of a personalization and a play with the lyric I. با لب دل قصه گو تا شنود گوش جان والیه خود بازدار لبز تکلم خموش. I think here Volière, who by all accounts is someone who is not afraid to speak and not afraid to write and not afraid to have her poetry disseminated, is in a way playing with ideas of silence that on the one hand is a nod to her gender, perhaps, but in the other, and I would be very interested to hear what Professor Qajar thinks about this. But on the other, I think she's nodding to Maulana here, and the way in which, as Fatemeh Qajar has argued in her book on Rumi, the way in which Maulana also plays with the idea of silence and inhabits, in a way, silence as a way of talking about the inadequacies of poetry or the need to transcend words. But in any case, that's something that we can talk about. I think it's very difficult to argue that this poem is not by someone who has a deep and profound knowledge of and appreciation for and really passion for medieval Persian poetry. what is very interesting is that when we look at the way in which Qajar poets imitate, and we start to kind of pick apart the imitation from when an imitation is done by a really talented poet, we find it's not only a response to a single poem, but as in this case, it really is a kind of multi-layered connection that is certainly to Hafiz, but because of the way in which medieval Persian poetry works, a chain of transmission goes back, in this case, to Saadi, perhaps also to Iraqi, and it goes kind of sideways in a way to certain poems by Kamal Khojandi, Salman Saveji, and Khaju Kermani. Of course, another way of looking at this imitation is to compare it to and see how it responds to very similar poems and very similar imitations of medieval poetry by Valier's contemporaries. And there are many good examples of that, both by male and by female poets. So her dialogue here, Valier's dialogue, is really not only with canonized giants of the past. Many of her contemporaries composed ghazals with the same formal features and shared imagic and narrative elements as hers, which are present in this poem. These obvious commonalities and the possibility that Valier influenced or was influenced by her contemporaries, both male and female, cannot be dismissed. Valier's kind of horizontal Qajar imitation and response includes at least 3 ghazals by her father, one by Rashhe Isfahani, a female panegyrist, the daughter of the foundational Bazgasht poet Hafiz Isfahani, one by Mejmar Isfahani, 2 by Nashad, and 2 by Qa'ani Shirazi. You know, all of them being very important poets central to the Tehran development of the Bazgasht. And a further 2 by the most significant female Sufi poet of Qajar Iran, Hayati Kermani, who was a skilled imitator of Hafiz and the widow of the Ne'matullahi leader and later martyr, Nur Ali Shah, who was, of course, himself a talented poet. In her childhood, Valier may have encountered Nashad, for example, in person at the royal court, and we know from another text that Nashad trained women of the royal household in writing poetry and in the appreciation of poetry. She could, of course, have heard his poetry recited at court on her regular visits to Tehran in her widowhood. Valier also had access to the well-stocked royal library that housed fine manuscript copies of Nashad's Divan, as well as numerous contemporary tazkirahs in which his poetry is anthologized. Knowledge of Hayati's poetry could have reached Valier either through reading a female-only tazkirah compiled in 1825, and I can talk about that later if you wish. But also, you know, Hayati's prominent standing in the Ne'matullahi community was such that her poetry may also have been accessible to Valier, who herself was very much involved, it would appear, in Sufi circles. It's of course possible that Valier had no direct contact with these poets, and that the similarities in the lexicon, the imagery, and the tone of these ghazals is in fact something that demonstrates the pervasiveness of a neoclassical Qajar literary zeitgeist. But regardless, the degree of stylistic and semantic overlap between ghazals produced by male and female panegyrists, as well as by amateur Sufi women poets, shows that by the 1830s, the Bazgasht ethos really had permeated well beyond the royal court, and that women who did not produce poetry for monetary reward composed ghazals in the provinces of a comparable quality to those penned by their professional counterparts at Tehran. I should now move on to the next slide to talk about Masture Kordestani. Again, I won't read these quotes, you can look at them as I'm talking about. Masture. The first is from that same anthology by Ronaq Sanandaji, who I should say is also the uncle, the amu of Masture. The second is from the very famous, of course, Reza Qoli Khan Hidayat, from his Majma al-Fusaha. And the third from Divan Begi Shirazi, also like Hidayat's work, a later Qajar Tazkira, a large Tazkira. I'm trying to be conscious of time, but I'm not sure what time it is. How much longer do I have, Mohammed? Or Azita is, maybe Azita is in charge, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that we have time for 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes, okay. So I should talk briefly about Mastura, and then we can look at at least one of her poems. The thing that is very interesting about Mastura for this discussion is that, of course, Wadia comes from Tehran. She comes from Tehran as a young woman, but nevertheless, she comes from Tehran. Mastura is in every sense, a product of the Sanandaj elite and of the Sanandaj Kurdish elite, and is related when we start to look through the poets who are presented in the Hadireh Amanullahi. Mastura Kurdistani is, of course, related to a good number of the poets there. They are blood relatives either of her father's family or of her mother's family. And both of these families were very prominent in the 18th and the 19th century in Sanandaj and in the Ardalan realm. In fact, Khusro Khan is Mastura's cousin, a maternal cousin. So she marries into the Ardalan family, but she's already blood related to that husband. Mastura was the second wife of Khusro Khan, and he took her apparently much to the kind of chagrin and disgust in a way of Wadia. It is possible that there was competition between these two women that was expressed through poetry. I think there is a certain amount of evidence of that. But the Hadireh Amanullahi, for example, does not mention this, because it's written for the second son of Wadia, who comes to rule after the first son is deposed. And he, by virtue of being a relative through Khusro Khan, of being a relative of Mastura herself, it's of course very unlikely that in an official court anthology of this type, that these kind of disputes between the two co-wives would be kind of amplified. So both are presented by Ronak in a very positive manner. But more attention is given to Mastura, who I think without doubt was a more talented writer and poet, and to a certain extent also thinker. Before saying something about the one poem by her that I wanted to present to you, it's worth remembering and recognizing that Mastura wrote much more than simply poetry. She has poetry that has survived primarily in Persian, but also in Gorani Kurdish. But she wrote also in Persian two other important works. One is really a text on Aqayed and Shar'iyat, both to do with creed, but more really to do with legal practice of individuals. What is very interesting about that text, it is aimed at women in particular. And it is said to have been written by Mastura as a way of responding to questions put to her by women of the extended family about legal matters that involve women in particular, but also the individual. And a work that is better known by her, which is either known as Tarikh Akrad or Tarikh Ardalan, is a history, a short history written by her to explain the key events of the Ardalan dynasty in the Zand and the early Qajar period. Mastura was writing her history up until her death. So it is something that she was working on in the last years of her life, but it is replete with personal observation, personal recollection, and she makes it very clear that, of course, she's not a completely neutral observer, but she makes it very clear to what extent her mother's family and her father's family were instrumental in the success in that period of the Ardalan dynasty, and is a keen observer of the involvement of a series of elite women, including Badiye, in the running of Kurdistan in her lifetime. As I said, we have poetry from Mastureh in Persian, but also in Gorani, in one of the Kurdish literary dialects, as it were, literary forms. Perhaps we can move to the next slide, which should be, yes, my translation and the text of a fascinating poem by Mastureh. Again, I will let you look at the poem itself. This poem could be classified as what is known by some as a fakhriye, or a self-praise poem. What is fascinating about this poem in particular is that Mastureh is imitating and working from the very famous late 13th century poem attributed to Padishah Khatun, who ruled Kerman very briefly in the 1290s. And she is not only quoting verbatim, there is tazmin from Padishah Khatun's poem, but she is very much responding to the tone of Padishah Khatun, which is unabashedly feminine, but also extremely a voice of power, and a voice that does not ignore gender, but that seeks to recognize and to assert, really, that women are able to rule if they are capable, if they are worthy, as really any other human, including all men of a similar caliber. Padishah Khatun has been written about for her political life, and to a certain extent for her poetry, because the few poems attributed to Padishah Khatun are amongst that group of pre-modern medieval Persian poems by female poets that are repeatedly inserted into and recycled in a way in anthologies of Persian poetry produced across the Persian world from at least the kind of late Timurid Safavid period onwards, and in a number of Qajar anthologies as well. Just to give you an idea of some of the phrases that are shared between the two, or that Mastureh is responding to. Padishah Khatun's own poem opens with this assertion of femininity and of female power, and starts in the same way. Man on zanam, I am that woman. Mastureh does the same as Padishah Khatun. But whereas Padishah Khatun immediately talks about her virtue, about her good works, and how underneath Bezir Maqna'eh, that you can see at the beginning of the second bait here, is another verbatim quotation from the opening of Padishah Khatun's poem, Underneath My Veil. Padishah Khatun says, underneath my veil, basi kolah darist, I really conceal with my virtue, with my veiled head, a crown beneath it and the ability to rule. Mastureh says the same thing, essentially. Vizir maqna'e ma ra sari as layiq afsar, vali che sood ke doran namude khar chenina. It seems to be a complaint. You could interpret it as a complaint vis-a-vis Wadiyeh, and vis-a-vis Wadiyeh's assertion of her royal power and as the first wife and the Qajar wife of Khosrow Khan, and how Masture, who perhaps is more capable in terms of her knowledge of Kurdistan, her connection through extended family networks, is perhaps suggesting that she should be the one that leads and she's been overlooked. But as you can see, and maybe if we turn to the last slide, you will see a comparison in a way of these two poems, in Persian at least. Padishah Khatuns followed by Masture Kurdistani, the blue being Tazmin, the light blue being an emphasis on virtue and on female chastity. They both do this. How they do it is slightly different, but they both do it. Temporal power, this claim to be a person who is more than capable of ruling, and as capable as any capable man of ruling, is something that we find in both poems. Gynocentricity and an emphasis on female networks, femininity, and not concealing gender is something that is displayed by both poets. The last section of Masture's poem, however, is devoted to reverence for and veneration of Imam Ali, which itself, of course, has a very interesting gendered dynamic to it. And she plays on that to a certain extent here. It should be remembered that the Ardalans themselves had adopted Shi'ism, most likely at some point fairly early on in the Safavid period. And so the elites of Qajar Sanandaj were primarily Shi'is, and Masture herself certainly seems to have been one of them. We can hopefully talk more in the discussion and the questions, but this brief discussion that I've presented here of the biographies and the works of Waliya Qajar and Masture Kurdistani has, I hope, given a sense that there existed women in this period who possessed significant cultural and also political capital in early 19th century Iran, and who stood out front and center in the regional literary networks of their day. These women were producers of poetry, not merely passive consumers of it, as we have really been led to believe for the most part. They shaped their literary communities and forged poetic networks. They demonstrated the depth of their literary erudition through fine imitations of and creative responses to canonized male and female poets of the past. Taken collectively, their oeuvre is characterized by an audacity that defies much of what has been published to date on the female poets of their period. In no way resembling the mute foremothers we've been led to believe such women were, Waliya and Masture used their written words to carve out a space for themselves in the public life of the time in which they lived. Thank you very much.